Okay, so today we're going to be looking at the poem Kamikaze from the AQA anthology. We're going to be exploring it in terms of first, which is just a neat little acronym that we use whenever we're approaching a poem, just to get some really quick but important annotations initially covered. Then we're going to layer on a little bit of context, and hopefully within the next 10 to 15 minutes, you're going to have a really, really clear idea of what this poem is all about. Okay, so Kamikaze. With first, essentially what we're doing is we're applying the acronym of first to get some initial annotations down. So F stands for first line and last line. Okay, so there is our first line and our last line covered. Okay, then we look to find one piece of imagery. Now the imagery can come from anywhere in the poem. What I tend to do to try and kind of hedge my bets is to just, if I don't know the poem already, in this case obviously I do, but if I didn't know the poem already, if this were an unseen poem, I'd just try and look for one of the longest lines of the poem, and then just see if it has got a nice amount of kind of imagery based detail. So I might go in and see, okay, which of these look quite long. Let's go with, what can we see? A flask of water, a samurai sword. Okay, so right near the beginning, we've got a nice piece of imagery there. That'll be absolutely fine. Then we look for any kind of repetition in the poem. Any repetition that we have. Can we find anything there? We don't seem to have much actual repetition of individual examples of language. So the alternative approach that we find if we can't find any actual repetition of words is we look for any repetition of themes, any kind of thematic ideas. Essentially what we're looking at here is kind of semantic fields or lexical fields. So essentially words in the same category as each other. So what we do have in this poem is lots and lots of really, really lovely kind of natural imagery. So that's going to be the repetition. We've got repeated references to nature. Okay, so what do we have? We have green, blue, translucent sea. We have shoals, dark shoals of fishes. We have pearl grey pebbles. We've got cloud-marked mackerel, black crabs, feathery prawns, the loose silver of a white bait, a tuna, dark prince, muscular and dangerous. Okay, so we've got a nice little bit of a semantic field there. So instead of writing repetition, so this is our R, we're just going to note that it is in fact a semantic field of nature. Okay, then we move on to S. S is for structure. So anything structurally that is done. And my eye is immediately drawn. So when we're doing structure, we can just look at the poem from a distance and see, okay, what visually stands out to us? Because that's usually something structural that has been done. What we have is kind of relatively consistent, nicely clipped stanzas that are at similar length. We don't have anything kind of wild going on. The only kind of wild moments that we have here is when we dive here into a little bit of italicized language, and we wonder why we're having these particular lines and this one as well made to stand out. Okay, so that's going to be something that we comment on in terms of structure. Okay, and then finally we're left with what is actually the first thing we see, which is the title, Kamikaze. Okay, so that's going to be our T. So once we have initially identified the first line, so that's F, first and last line, I for imagery, repetition, R, structure, S, and T, title, we then go into annotating them in the order that they come up in the poem. Not the order of the acronym, but the order they come up in the poem. So title first. Why do we do that? Well, quite simply because we are looking at the experience of being someone who is reading this poem. That way we can comment on the experience that is created by what the poet has done in terms of their linguistic choices, their structural choices, their thematic choices, etc., and our experience of reading it. Okay, so we're going to start with the title, the very first thing that we come up against, which gives us our first impression. Now, it is just one word. Okay, just one word. So we always, if we're lacking a determiner, we're going to comment on that. So a determiner would be a word like the. You know, So an article like the, it could be my, which would be a possessive determiner, this, which would be a demonstrative determiner, but there's no determiner here. So we're looking here potentially at something generic. Does this apply to all kamikaze pilots? Okay, then we go, okay, well, it's one word. There's not much we can really do with that. We're just thinking, okay, kamikaze. So this is going to be about a suicide bombing mission. Okay, crazy. Okay, that's the focus of this poem. What are we going to do about that? Then we jump into our first and last line. Okay, so the first line of the poem, the first impression that we get is from her father embarked at sunrise. Okay, so her father. Okay, so immediately we're wondering, who is she? And what we've also got here is a sense of distance. Okay, what I mean by that is it is her father, so not my father, so it's not told in the first person. So it's already told in the third person, but one step removed from the father. Okay, so we've got two layers there, haven't we? So we are the, well, in fact, there's more than two layers. We are the reader, okay? We're reading the poem, which is another layer, which is told by the poet, which is another layer, which is referred to by the father's experience, which is another layer, told by her, the daughter of this father, okay? So there's lots of distance created from this actual story. Comparatively, by the end, we get a really intimate insight into dwelling on the nature of life and death. So sometimes he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. Okay, so this is a very intimate reflection on the nature of reputation and survival and all of those sorts of things, in comparison with the very much distanced beginning that we have. So over the course of the poem, what's happening is we're getting progressively more intimate until we get to that final reflection at the end of the poem. So that's immediately a structural point that we can comment on beyond just this structural moment here, because we have a change from the start to the end. That, my friends, is structure. Then we're going to have a look at the piece of imagery that I picked out. Okay, so that piece of imagery that I picked out right here with a flask of water, a samurai sword. Okay, so straight away, what do we have here? We have juxtaposition. Okay, what's the point of that? Juxtaposition. So we could just leave that and go, hey, examiner, look at me. I know this key terminology of juxtaposition, but juxtaposition needs to have a purpose. There is no point in pointing out any literary or linguistic feature or poetic device if we're not commenting on the effect that it has. And the effect that it has is we have contrasting ideas here. Juxtaposition between being this kind of cold-blooded killer with the samurai sword and being this essentially fragile human. How is that generated? Well, a flask of water. What are we as humans but water-based carbon life forms, right? We're over 70% water. The fact that this person is depending on water, it's a reminder of their humanity. A reminder of their humanity. They depend on this water to feel fine. But at the same time, they're expected to be a cold-blooded killer. So straight away in the second line of the poem, we're having this person's humanity really drawn attention to. Okay, they are not just a suicide bomber, an unnamed person. They are someone who is human, fragile, and therefore someone that we might have a little bit of sympathy for. And this is on top of the fact that it is her father that we are looking at. Her father, which is another way of humanizing this character, because it is a relationship. Okay, we have our imagery covered. Then for repetition. So what is the significance of this semantic field of nature? Well, I would say again, it's playing the same role as the juxtaposition here. We're looking at further juxtaposition between creation / life and the impending doom that comes from being a kamikaze pilot. Okay, so what we have here is this really soft, idyllic, kind of gentle imagery of nature, of the sea below, and that contrasting with the intense violent, destructive force that is this plane heading towards its target. Of course, it's never going to get there, but that kind of imagery there is really, really significant. And then on top of the nature imagery, kind of layered on top of it, we also have nostalgic imagery. So we've kind of got two semantic fields operating simultaneously, and that nostalgia is yet another way of drawing attention to the fact that this is someone who is human. Okay? Beautiful. Then we're going to comment on structure. And the structure, I just want to kind of have a look at the fact that we've got right here. Although he never came back, and though he never came back, my mother never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes, and the neighbors too. They treated him as though, okay, so if it is my mother and my father, okay, we realize here that we have become closer, okay? So the italicized portion, it is from the mother's POV. So the mother is the daughter of the pilot, okay? So the daughter's own perspective, which means that we have become closer, more intimate at this point in the poem, which of course dovetails beautifully with our point earlier about ending on an intimate reflection from this very distant beginning that we have of her father embarked at sunrise. Okay, so we get this kind of much more intimate reflection on if you have a look at the actual content that comes up here, it's really interesting. Never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes. They treated him as though he no longer existed. Okay, we learned to be silent. Okay, no longer the father we loved. Okay, so all of these pieces of imagery are incredibly intimate reflections on very complex emotions, the actual fallout of the fact that this kamikaze pilot didn't go through with his intended mission. Okay, so from the distance that's created at the start, by the end we get a much, much closer experience of what is going on in our poem. Then we layer on our context. Okay, so our context, we're looking at Beatrice Garland, that is the poet. Now, she never experienced war and has no connections to Japan, so this is very much an imaginative piece, which might make you go, okay, well, what can I comment on in terms of context? Well, she is, however, not a poet by trade, but a psychologist, okay? Which means that the poems that she writes focus on things like trauma, relationships, and memory, which very, very much relates to this idea in the poem. So this poem is kind of representative of her larger poetic oeuvre. Okay, more kind of broadly contextually, we know what kamikaze refers to, but that is our only reference point to something concrete within the real world, and that is obviously at the back end of World War II. In the face of impending defeat, Japan sent many young men, often teens, to die in suicide bombing missions in the name of honor and the emperor. They were the kamikaze pilots. Okay, so when it says kamikaze, we have this knowledge called upon by the title being kamikaze. Okay, so it immediately plucks out that existing knowledge that we can make reference to in our response. Okay, so there we have, in about 13 minutes, a whistle-stop tour of kamikaze. Hopefully you feel a little bit more confident with it now.